Modern Drunkard magazine presents the 10 greatest alcohol icons of all time. The story behind the face on the bottle. Part 1. First up, the striding man. All dressed up and somewhere to go. Johnnie Walker Scotch whiskey. Though the company was launched way back in 1820, the exercise-obsessed dandy who would lead Johnnie Walker to the pinnacle of Scotch supremacy didn't hit the ground walking until 1908. Modeled after the company's founder, Johnnie Walker. The character was drawn by famed illustrator Tom Brown under the direction of George Walker, John's grandson. And if you're wondering why John looks a little young in that statue, it's because he started his whiskey company when he was 14. They grew up a little faster back then. Initially called the Regency Buck, the icon's moniker was later toned down to the more descriptive, if less dashing, the striding man. The family name had more than a little to do with the logo's ambulatory nature. Why it worked. His top hat, walking stick, breeches, and riding boots promise a refined product for an upscale market. Combine that with his elusiveness. Yes, he can see you fine through his fancy monocle. He simply doesn't have time to dally with the likes of you. And it makes for a very attractive symbol for the rung-climbing careerist set with money to burn. This formula also dovetails nicely with Johnnie Walker's ladder of incrementally expensive color-coded whiskeys. Evolution. In the early adverts, the striding man wasn't always striding. He'd pause for a bit of golf, then walk the greens. He'd walk amongst the barrels, then pop into a stained glass workshop. He'd do a bit of jaywalking, then hang out with the lads. His boots would go walking by themselves. Then he'd barge in your door when you least expected it. But mostly he walked. He walked through airplanes, through business meetings. He walked with his buddies. He engaged in a bit of foreshadowing. He walked past massive bottles and ships. He tried selling some cigarettes on the side. He walked through the pages of glossy magazines and cheap newsprint. He cheat-walked. He walked past his doppelganger. He walked around the clock and through all the seasons. Man, that guy really loved to walk. And why not? It kept him healthy, unchanged, and ageless, right up until 1996. All that pacing must have helped him think, because during that fateful year he appeared to solve the riddle of invisibility. Overnight, the striding man devolved from a dashing Regency buck to a dashed-off, half-finished doodle. Why the change? Brand designers are ever striving to make marketing symbols simpler and thus easier to recognize. And in this case, you'd have to recognize Johnny by his threads, because his face was gone. Then, in 2015, perhaps realizing they'd gone much, much too far, a new design rolled out, returning some of his anatomy. His face is but a crude shadow, but at least he has a face. Am I right? Dark Secret was once a bootlegger. During America's ugly bout with prohibition, the distillery engaged in what they called their special trade, that being the delivery of boatloads of their whiskey into the hands of rum runners working from small Canadian isles near the U.S. coast. Claim to fame. Aside from dominating the worldwide Scotch market, Johnnie Walker is Superman's choice of liquor. The Hamm's Bear. Lovable beast or voodoo priest? Hamm's Brewing Company. The joyous bear-haunting baby boomer's dreams was reputedly sketched to life on a bar napkin by ad exec Cleo Havel, then fine-tuned by Ojibwa Indian artist Patrick Desjarlais. After appearing in a few print ads, the bear launched his television career in 1953. He was paired with an earworm jingle so catchy that once you hear it, it will haunt you forever.
From the land of sky-blue water, from the land of pines, lofty balsams, comes a beer refreshing, Hamm's a beer refreshing.
You want to know a secret? Those drums in the background? They weren't modeled after Native American rhythms. Ad executive Ray Mithun, who was in charge of the Hamm's account, based those drums on recordings of a Haitian voodoo ritual. That's right. Devil magic. Does this explain the bear's smashing success? Maybe. Let's hear it one more time in case you're wearing a protective amulet or charm.
Hints of lakes and sunset breezes, dance and sparkle in each glassful. Hamm's the a beer refreshing. Hamm's a beer refreshing.
And that should do it. You're cursed. Welcome aboard. The wildly popular commercials employed plot devices ranging from good old-fashioned fun, like pie fights and log rolling, to more risque activities, such as train robbery, gunplay, arson, and gleeful wolf abuse. The spots would saturate the airwaves for well over 30 years, which is especially impressive when you consider Spuds MacKenzie lasted less than 3. The commercials helped Hamm's grow from a 15th-place regional brew to the 5th most popular beer in the country. Though his name was never revealed on air, around the brewery the cartoon bear was called Sasha. Why? Because Sasha was the name of the real bear Hamm's borrowed from the Los Angeles Zoo to do some TV spots in 1973. Hamm's went through a number of ownership changes starting in 1966, and every new owner tried ditching Sasha for some new ad concept. And every time Hamm's sales started tanking, so they always went back to the bear, right up until the early 1990s. Sasha was eventually and inevitably slain by an ever-growing army of shrill nanny staters who claimed the cartoon bear was hustling beer to children. Presently, Molson Coors brews Hamm's beer for select markets, but you won't see much of Sasha. You'll find him on their website, but only as a nod to the brewery's heritage. The monstrous amount of Sasha-related ephemera cranked out during his long reign has become quite collectible, and the lovable mammal is still celebrated by the Hamm's Club, which throws a yearly get-together. Why it worked. Most beer commercials of the day involved some shill swearing their American-style pale lager was somehow superior to all the other American-style pale lagers, while the Hamm spots came equipped with humor, plot, and punchline, with Sasha usually the one getting punched. The occasional interaction between cartoons and real actors was groundbreaking. Sasha beat Roger Rabbit to the punch by 40 years. Sasha eventually reached such heights of popularity-inspired hubris that he felt compelled to step into the ring with undefeated boxing legend Rocky Marciano. Rocky remained undefeated at the end of the commercial. Evolution. Sasha's appearance changed a bit over the decades, including the transition from black and white to color. He sired a cub at one point and eventually learned to speak.
It bears repeating.
The only major mutation was his occasional Pinocchio-esque transformation into a real bear. Dark secret. Sasha was probably a stoner. All the signs are there: perpetually goofy grin, impromptu hippie-style dancing at the sound of drums, and militant veganism. His single attempt to break his diet with a little fish concluded with him shooting a hole through the bottom of the boat. Claim to fame. In 1965, the Audit Research Bureau reported the Hamm's bear mascot was the best-liked advertisement in the country. Also, according to noted beer historian Bill Yen, the Hamm's bear was probably the greatest animated animal icon in the history of American brewing. Next, Captain Morgan. Preening pirate or bloodthirsty buccaneer? Captain Morgan Rum Company. He may appear a bit of a fop on the bottle, but the real Captain Morgan was cut from a rougher swath of cloth. Captain Henry Morgan, 1635 through 1688, was a Welsh privateer who won English knighthood and historical renown for his daring and quite bloodthirsty attacks on Spanish colonies and shipping. He was also a notorious drunkard. While pirating and during his stint as the deputy governor of Jamaica, he drank rum by the gallon and was a dedicated habitué of the rough-and-tumble taverns of whatever port he might find himself in. Though their labels have insinuated otherwise, the rum has no historical connection to its namesake. The Captain Morgan Rum Company was created by liquor giant Seagram's in 1944. Why it worked. Pirates enjoy the same privileged status in the popular consciousness as ninjas, mafioso, and gunslingers. At once flamboyant, murderous, and disdainful of authority, the pirate was the ultimate rebel. And what red-blooded drunkard hasn't yearned to sail the high seas in search of rum, wenches, and adventure? Evolution. According to legend, CEO Sam Bronfman drew inspiration from a John Steinbeck biography of the real Captain Morgan called Cup of Gold. In the initial 1940s adverts, the captain appeared plump, unarmed, and with his hat respectfully doffed to the high society types he seemed to be hanging around with. But the homicidal gleam in his eye was unmistakable, no doubt fantasizing about running the gang of snobs through with his cutlass and making off with their wives and wallets. On the bottles, he was barely visible, just a head inside a crest. He stayed there until the 1970s, when his full, albeit small, body topped the labels. They started spicing the rum in the early 80s, and the icon became rather spicy himself. He shed his social graces, put his hat back on, and began brandishing his sword in a menacing fashion. The new, more cartoonish incarnation of the captain was drawn by fantasy and sci-fi artist Don Mites in 1982. And while there was still fire in the captain's eyes, it seems more the leer of a sexual predator than the bloodthirsty gleam of a proper pirate. In the early 2000s, after getting some heat about allegedly using a cartoon to lure children into the clutches of demon rum, the captain was redesigned once again as a more traditional and realistic illustration. That apparently wasn't far enough, however, because recently the good captain has been further decartooned into a much simpler symbol, plainly taking the same path as Johnnie Walker. Side note, in 2014, Diageo, the current owners of Captain Morgan, sued Heaven Hill Distilleries for their depiction of Admiral Horatio Nelson on their bottles of Admiral Nelson rum. Diageo thought the images a bit too similar. Diageo won the case, but the judgment only applied to the nation of Canada, which is why you'll still find the historically inaccurate, one-eyed, two-armed Admiral Nelson riding the waves at your local liquor store, unless you live in Canada. Dark secret. Captain Morgan slew legendary drunkard and actor Oliver Reed. Reed had a heart attack after downing 3 bottles of Captain Morgan's Jamaica rum, along with beer and other liquors, and whipping 5 Royal Navy sailors at arm wrestling in a pub on the island of Malta. Claim to fame. After holding the number 2 spot for decades, Captain Morgan is currently the 8th best-selling liquor brand in America. It's the 2nd best-selling rum, right behind our next icon. The Bacardi Bat. Piss off the bat and he'll bomb you. Bacardi rum. If company legend is to be believed, and it rarely should be, a bat found its way onto the Bacardi label in 1862 because the wife of the distillery's founder noticed a colony of fruit bats hanging around the rafters of the converted warehouse that was their first distillery. The bat was considered a noble and lucky creature by Cubans, so it seemed a smart move to attach the symbol to the fledgling rum. An alternative history, strenuously denied by Bacardi, is that the bat got the nod because every morning distillery workers had to fish the lucky, noble, and thoroughly intoxicated creatures out of the rum vats. The rum found quick favor in Cuba and spread rapidly throughout the Americas. Prohibition gave it a boost thanks to Cuba's close proximity to the U.S. coast, and by the 50s the bat was flying high as the best-selling rum in the United States. Then came the communists. Despite the fact that Bacardi helped bankroll the Cuban Revolution, and the daughter of one of its top execs was married to Raúl Castro, brother of Fidel, the Bacardi family was driven out of Cuba and their holdings nationalized when Fidel seized power. The Bacardi clan never forgave this betrayal, and have used their considerable political and financial influence to make things difficult for Cuba ever since. Why it worked. The aforementioned locals not only considered the bat good mojo, they were also largely illiterate. They couldn't read the verbose Spanish praising the product on the early labels, but they could recognize the bat just fine. When the rum spread to more literate countries, the exotic mammal matched up well with what Westerners thought of rum. Nocturnal danger with a hint of vampirism. Evolution. The Bacardi Bat has changed over the decades, seeming to bounce between reality and symbol with each new generation of Bacardis. After a long run as a simplified and soulless symbol, its current form is a stunning throwback to an earlier time. Dark secret. Embittered Bacardi helmsman Jose Pepin Bosch bought a surplus B-26 bomber with the hopes of bombing his ex-pal Fidel's oil refineries, which I totally get. Revenge is a dish best served from about 15,000 feet with a full payload of incendiary bombs. And if I were Jose, I would have painted the bomber to look like the Bacardi Bat. Just so Fidel knew the score. This bold plan was foiled when a picture of the bomber appeared on the front page of the snitchy New York Times. He was also allegedly involved in the CIA plot to assassinate Castro. Claim to fame. Bacardi was the first refined rum. The founder, Spanish emigrant Don Facundo Bacardi Maso, tamed the raw New World spirit by experimenting with charcoal filtering and oak barrel aging. After starting with its single and singular brand of rum, Bacardi Limited now presides over 200 brands of booze. And unlike all the other alcohol conglomerates, it's still family-owned. Next up, Old Mr. Boston, the streetwise dandy, Old Mr. Boston Distillery. The Old Mr. Boston Distillery sprang to life in 1933, founded by Boston natives Irwin Red Benjamin and Hyman C. Berkowitz. There was no real Old Mr. Boston. The icon is merely an artist's conception of what a genteel 19th-century Bostonian who liked a bit of liquor might look like. He was formally introduced to the drinking community in the inaugural 1935 edition of the Old Mr. Boston Deluxe Official Bartender's Guide with this glowing copy. He is a jolly fellow, one of those rare individuals, everlastingly young, a distinct personality and famous throughout the land for his sterling qualities and genuine good fellowship. His friends number in the millions, those who are great and those who are near great, even as you and I. He is jovial and ever ready to accept the difficult role of life of the party and who may be relied upon in any emergency." End quote. While it's easy to think of the beaver-hatted Mr. Boston as Johnnie Walker's Yank cousin, Mr. B is by no means snooty. Far from it. Would a snob attach his visage and reputation to a mint-flavored gin, much less something called wild cherry nectar? Assuredly not. If anything, Mr. Boston is a fiery-eyed rebel, a bold innovator willing to disregard any rule you set in front of him. During his long history, he has not only smiled agreeably from bottles of vodka, whiskey, rum, and gin, but also from, shall we say, less conventional potations. Have a hankering for orange gin, a whiskey named after the bottle it's in, a dry liqueur named after its proof or color, a quarter pint of, yes, 5-star grape-flavored brandy. Mr. B has you covered. Why it worked. Though his rarefied appearance suggests a superior product, his portly stature, easygoing grin, and the fact he was sometimes pictured casually slumped in a rocking chair suggested he was willing to hook you up with a deal. And he usually did. When they opened their distillery immediately after the repeal of Prohibition, Hyman and Irwin set their sights on the bottom shelf, and their aim was true. By not focusing so much on quality, they were able to undersell almost all of their competitors. But don't think that was their only shtick. The distillery was a hotbed of innovation and experimentation. They were apparently willing to roll out whatever kooky flavor popped into their heads. If they are remembered for anything, besides their ubiquitous cocktail guide, it should be for the sheer number of bizarre liquors they laid on the public. Evolution. Because the distillery changed hands on a regular basis, Old Mr. Boston was forced to endure a multitude of transformations. During the youth-worshipping 1970s, Old was dropped. He slimmed down and corrected his posture. In the mid-'80s, he vanished altogether. There were rumors he had checked into rehab. In 1995, Barton Incorporated acquired the brand and brought back a simplified version of the original middle-aged gent. The latest owners, the Sazerac Company, have streamlined his countenance even further. He's gotten younger. He foolishly shaved off his fantastic mutton chop sideburns and now refuses to make eye contact because he has no eyes. And the once jolly Mr. Boston is now a cold caricature of his old self. Dark secret. During the 1980s, Mr. Boston's line of budget-priced flavored brandies and brandy-like nectars were attacked as being deliberately marketed to the denizens of Skid Row. Claim to fame. Old Mr. Boston's Official Bartender's Guide was the best-selling cocktail guide of all time. I say was because there may or may not be any further editions. Time will tell.